As the late 1970s approached, Chrysler was in big financial trouble yet again. The company had introduced new full-size C-body models for 1974, which were still atop a 124-inch wheelbase, but were about 5 inches shorter than the previous fuselage generation. And these vehicles promptly flopped in the marketplace when the OPEC embargo hit in the late 1970s, almost at the same time these vehicles were launched. Few in the planning department at Chrysler's Highland Park headquarters had foreseen the imminent energy crisis that arrived in 1973 just as these new C-body cars arrived. And within a short period of time, several months of stock had piled up on dealer lots. However, in spite of this excess inventory, Chrysler's chairman Lynn Townsend refused to slash prices and instead cut production. By doing so, he effectively reduced the company's revenues by about a third, and Chrysler experienced some extreme financial losses as it could not cut its fixed costs fast enough to align with lower volume projections. The results were significant employee layoffs and unsold inventory of about 300,000 units by early 1975. After a period of time, Chrysler finally reversed course and introduced sales rebates, something that no one in the Big Three had ever done before, that effectively paid people to buy cars. It's a sales tactic that still remains in use today and started out in light of Chrysler's sales challenges on these big full-size cars. And while this tactic did partially spur sales in the short term, it really didn't improve Chrysler's financials. And by 1976, Chrysler was left with little cash, and its new president, John Ricardo, was already approaching U.S. President Jimmy Carter for a federal government bailout. He was promptly turned down at the time. Shortly thereafter, in the fall of 1976, General Motors released its all-new full-size vehicle lineup that was radically downsized, shaving off almost a foot in overall length and 700 pounds in weight. The car that most people remember during this time that best exemplified GM's downsizing was the Chevrolet Caprice and the Impala. The Caprice won Motor Trend's Car of the Year in 1977, but all General Motors full-size cars were downsized in that year, including the Pontiac Bonnevilles and Catalinas, the Olds 88s and 98s, Buick LeSabres and Electras, and even the Cadillac DeVilles and Fleetwoods were also shorter, lighter, and had a more sheer look than their predecessors. One step behind General Motors, but also in front of Chrysler, was Ford, who was developing vehicles for the 1979 model year that would come off of the Panther platform, including the LTD and the Mercury Marquis. Both the full-size GM and Ford platforms would end up lasting an extremely long period of time, with the GM platform lasting 19 years and the Ford Panther platform lasting 32 years. But in response to this downsizing, Chrysler put together a rush job based on the historical midsize B-body architecture that was introduced in 1962. This architecture would be called the Chrysler R Body, and it would last just 3 model years, 1979, 1980, and 1981, before being discontinued and succeeded in the lineup by what would then become Chrysler's largest vehicles, the M bodies, which included the Plymouth Gran Fury, the Dodge Diplomat, as well as the Chrysler Fifth Avenue and New Yorker. The R bodies would then become one of the shortest-lived platforms in Detroit history, and they certainly are worthy of conversation. So let's talk a bit more about them. There were 4 models that were spawned from the R body. In the Chrysler lineup, there was the Chrysler Newport, the New Yorker, and the New Yorker also introduced a top-of-the-line Fifth Avenue trim, a name that would later soldier on into Chrysler history. In the Dodge lineup, Dodge had the St. Regis with the interesting translucent headlight covers, and Plymouth had the Gran Fury. The Gran Fury was only introduced for the 1980 to 1981 model years. All the other vehicles were introduced in 1979 for the 1979 to 81 model years. All R bodies came in one form. That was a 4-door pillared sedan. But in a similar vein as Ford had done in the mid-70s, Chrysler called these pillared hardtops as they didn't have a frame at the top of the door glass. No station wagons, coupes, or convertibles of these R bodies were ever offered, predominantly because Chrysler just simply couldn't afford the developmental expense and capital investment. All of the R bodies had a quite blocky, upright design to them. And you have to remember that this was during a time when the 1976 to 79 Cadillac Seville was proving hugely successful in the marketplace. And it had really set the tone for new styling direction, similar to what the 1986 Ford Taurus and Mercury Sable had done. Only those were obviously much more rounded cars than the 1976 to 79 Seville. Chrysler's design team thus arguably took some of that, what GM called sheer look styling, and imparted it onto these Chryslers, with the hope that it would make the cars look more upscale and better sellers. Initially, it proved somewhat successful as well, as in 1979, the Chrysler New Yorker, Newport, and St. Regis, the models that were available during that year, sold about 150,000 units, which wasn't bad for the time. However, in 1979, the second oil crisis came, and that unfortunately caused the car sales to plummet in the subsequent 1980 model year. In 1980, the same three models, the New Yorker, Newport, and St. Regis, which had sold around 150,000 units in 1979, had really sold just about 50,000 units in 1980. And by 1981, those three models had sold about 25,000 units. So the sales volumes were cut down to 25,000 units by 1981 of those three models that were introduced in the 1979 model year. While the Plymouth Gran Fury was added in 1980, it really was not a great seller either, selling less than 15,000 units in 1980 and 1981 in each year. Thus, after taking one gut punch from releasing its new full-size C bodies in 1974, just as the first oil crisis was breaking, Chrysler's timing left them doing about the same play for these R bodies. And it set in motion the need for Chrysler to approach the federal government yet again for a bailout. However, this time, somebody new had landed at the helm of Chrysler, newly excommunicated from Ford and now hired by Chrysler's board of directors. Lee Iacocca would soon become the face of the company and really help accelerate its turnaround. By 1983, the company would have repaid all its creditors, including the federal government, of all of the bailout funds, and would be on its way to financial success for at least the short-term future. And while many people tend to remember the K cars, and how could you not, with all the variants that they spawned, including the minivans of the 1980s, and people also remember the full-size Chryslers of earlier years, and of course the sports cars, these R bodies are often forgotten as part of Chrysler's history, probably because, as mentioned before, they were one of the shortest-lived platforms in automotive history. They also weren't available to be equipped with what were formerly beloved big block engines like Chrysler 440s. These R bodies only had the 225 cubic inch slant 6, Chrysler's workhorse 318 V8, and the 360 cubic inch V8 available in them, and were always coupled to a 3-speed TorqueFlite automatic transmission. They did prove especially popular with police departments, who appreciated the relatively fine handling of these cars, especially in comparison to the Fords of the era, which were still rather large and quite wallowy. And the handling with its torsion bar front suspension and rear leaf spring setup was arguably even better than the General Motors downsized cars, the B bodies from 1977. However, in spite of the improved handling, some customers did not care for Chrysler's ride, which amazingly, these R bodies somehow emulated almost exactly the ride of the full-size C bodies that preceded them, for better or worse. That meant a relatively choppy ride over rough pavement, but one that enabled greater handling. It's something that some buyers, perhaps for particular vehicles, were interested in, but you can imagine in a Chrysler Fifth Avenue New Yorker might not have been the most optimal suspension setup for customers who are used to super cushy floaty boat rides in their luxury cars. Overall, it is quite remarkable that Chrysler was able to reinvigorate its old B-body platform from 1962 and come out with these R bodies, and they were uniquely styled for the time, did have relatively nice interiors, some strange features, including the translucent retractable headlight covers on the Dodge St. Regis, and numerous items introduced to facilitate weight savings. including substituting plastic wheel cylinders and brake components for metal ones, which eventually swelled up after a few years and caused significant braking challenges. In some cases, bumpers were also made from stamped aluminum and plated with chrome, and often peeled shortly thereafter. These are also some of the only cars that I know from the era that have a single-row radiator core design. Most GM and Ford products used either 2- or 3-row radiators during this time, but Chrysler was somehow able to get away with just this single row of cooling in their radiators, and it generally worked. On the more successful side, the R Bodies did release a new Chrysler-designed AC compressor that was later used on all models and was significantly lighter than previous versions, saving about 10 pounds per car. These were also Chrysler's first cars that replaced nagging buzzers with electronic chimes. So what's it like to drive one of these vehicles? Well, I can say from having driven an R-Body Chrysler as well as the GM and Fords from the time, I'll say that the Chryslers do genuinely handle better than the GM and Ford cars. They really have a nice, almost sporty car-like feel to them in spite of their size. They also have relatively good interior packaging efficiency and dimensions. Where they do fall down, though, is in overall ride comfort and noise. As these cars, I wouldn't call them noisy, particularly the New Yorkers and the New Yorker Fifth Avenues. The Plymouth Gran Furies and the Dodge St. Regis can be a little noisy on the inside. And part of that is due to the fact that they didn't use all that much sound deadening, that they were unibody as opposed to body-on-frame, which the GM and Ford products were of the era. And these cars from Chrysler even use thinner glass in an attempt to save weight. So it contributes to the cabins being a bit noisier, especially on the lower-end models. That said, I will say that driving one of them does put a smile on one's face. They are super unique. You don't see hardly any of them around anymore. And if you want one, just make sure that a lot of the electronic systems work, as they also did have some electronic issues. And you also get under hood that wonderful lean burn setup. In any case, hope you enjoyed this overview of Chrysler's R Body. Thanks again for watching. Until next time, take care, and check out the video thumbnails at bottom left and bottom right for some suggestions for you.